On a small stage in the 21st century, the lights are no longer harsh, no longer accompanied by the showy performances that once defined rock decades ago. A man stands before the microphone, thin frame, hair silvered by time. He is not in a hurry. He does not need to impress. Then he begins to sing. No trembling, no cracking, no attempt to avoid the high notes that were once the privilege of youth. That moment creates a strange sensation, not excitement, but doubt. Because this voice, by every conventional rule of rock, should no longer exist. It is the voice of Glenn Hughes, once called the voice of rock. A title that sounds exaggerated, even arrogant, until one confronts the truth behind it. Drugs, collapse. Years in which he nearly erased himself from the map of rock. Stages that no longer called his name. Opportunities slipping away in silence. And yet somehow, that voice is still here. The question of this story is not whether Glenn Hughes has talent. That has long been clear. The question is, what happens when a person nearly destroys himself, but the most fragile thing in an artist's life, the voice, refuses to disappear? Rock has produced countless legends who died young. Names made immortal precisely because they did not live long enough to witness the fading of their own glory. But Glenn Hughes does not belong to that list. He did not become an icon through a final tragedy. He exists as an exception, someone still alive, still singing, still standing there, facing his own past. Even when he joined Deep Purple, one of the most powerful bands in the history of hard rock, Glenn Hughes was never the center of attention. He was not a guitar hero, not a born frontman, not the one who defined the sound through riffs or technique. What he brought with him was something else: soul. A voice saturated with funk rhythm, Motown breath, and the emotion of R&B in a world accustomed to raw power. That very difference carried him to the top, and that same difference ensured that he never truly belonged anywhere completely. This is not the story of a man who conquered his era, nor the journey of someone who dominated rock history. This is the story of a voice that should have vanished, but chose to stay. Of a man who did not become a museum of the past, did not live off old legends, but continued to exist, day by day, stage by stage, breath by breath. And in rock, sometimes, survival itself is the most revolutionary act. Glenn Hughes was born in Cannock, a small town in Staffordshire, not far from Birmingham, yet distant enough not to be swallowed by the molds already taking shape. Birmingham in the late 1960s was the cradle of a kind of music that was heavy, raw, and metallic. Guitars roared, drums pressed down with weight. British blues rock was searching for ways to become harsher, louder, stronger. But Glenn Hughes was listening to something else. While many of his generation grew up on Cream or Led Zeppelin, Glenn was drawn toward American soul, Motown, Stevie Wonder. Voices that did not need to scream to dominate, but instead curved along the rhythm, slid between intervals, carrying bodily emotion rather than mechanical force. He learned to sing like an R&B artist, not merely producing sound, but living inside each note. Because of that, when he stepped into rock, Glenn did not bring with him the familiar weapons of hard rock. He did not rely on heavy riffs to assert himself. He did not adhere to the standard 12-bar blues structure. His voice was flexible, groove-rich, with a softness and elasticity that British rock of that era rarely accepted. The first meeting point between Glenn Hughes and the rock world was Trapeze, But Trapeze was not a typical hard rock band. Their music blended rock with funk, groove, and the looseness of soul. There, Glenn did not just sing. He played bass. He led the rhythm. He turned the voice into part of the groove, rather than standing above it as a traditional frontman. Trapeze made one thing very clear. Glenn Hughes never fully belonged to any mold. He was too black in feeling to be pure British rock, so yet too rock to become a true soul artist. He stood between two worlds, and neither truly opened its arms. That sense of displacement was not an accident. It was his nature. From very early on, Glenn Hughes was an outsider, someone carrying a different language into a space not designed for him. And while this did not cause an immediate tragedy, it quietly laid the foundation for his entire musical life ahead. A journey that would always require adaptation, always demand proof, and rarely allow him to feel completely at home. He stepped into the years that followed with a different voice, a different sense of rhythm, and an unspoken question that lingered beneath it all. Was there a place in the world of hard rock for a soul spirit? In 1973, as Deep Purple stood before a major turning point, Glenn Hughes entered the band not as a victor, but as a gamble. Roger Glover was gone. Ian Gillan was no longer there. The shadow of Mark II still weighed heavily over every decision. Deep Purple needed new blood, but no one was certain whether that blood would bring life or push the band more quickly toward collapse. Glenn Hughes did not arrive alone. He appeared alongside David Coverdale, another voice, another color. And suddenly, Deep Purple, a band once defined by raw power and rigid structure, had two singers, two personalities, two parallel musical worlds. On the other side of the stage stood the immovable pillars, Ritchie Blackmore with his dominating guitar, John Lord with the majestic architecture of the Hammond, and Ian Pace, the band's enduring heartbeat. Deep Purple entered the Mark III era with a lineup that was powerful, yet more fragile than ever. The change did not arrive gradually. It erupted immediately in Burn. The album still had hard rock, still had speed, still carried the familiar explosive moments. But beneath it lay something that had never existed in Deep Purple before. Groove, funk, rhythmic flexibility. Glenn Hughes did not merely sing. He bent his voice, pushed the pulse, pulled the band toward the soul he carried with him from the days of Trapeze. That transformation became even more pronounced on Stormbringer. Here, funk was no longer an accent. It became part of the identity. Deep Purple did not just roar. They swayed. They played with the space between the beats. And it was precisely this that both expanded the band's boundaries and exposed its deepest fractures. The problem was not musical quality. It was the question: who were Deep Purple? For Ritchie Blackmore, the answer remained firmly tied to pure hard rock, guitar-led, undiluted power. Funk, to him, was a distraction. Soul was an unwanted detour. Creative tension gradually turned into personal conflict. Recording sessions were no longer places to search for common ground, but battlefields of opposing visions. Glenn Hughes brought new colors, but those colors did not dissolve. They collided. They forced Deep Purple to change faster than the band itself could endure. The band moved forward, but not in the same direction. And while audiences heard boldness, inside, Deep Purple's identity was cracking layer by layer. The truth is this: Glenn Hughes did not break Deep Purple. But he exposed something that had previously been concealed by success. That Deep Purple had never been an unchanging, unified whole. And when soul entered hard rock, not everyone was willing to pay the price for that transformation. When Ritchie Blackmore left Deep Purple, the band did not merely lose a guitar hero. They lost the final axis that kept all contradictions within control. Deep Purple entered the Mark IV era with a promising replacement. Tommy Bolin, young, talented, open to funk and fusion, carrying a free-spirited sensibility very different from Blackmore. On paper, it was a rebirth. In reality, it was a race against time. Come Taste the Band was born in that context. The album sold well. The music was more modern, softer, more flexible. By this point, Glenn Hughes was no longer just the voice. He became the band's energetic center, carrying the bass, the vocals, and the unclaimed spaces of leadership that no one officially took on. But outward success could not conceal the inner chaos. Cocaine seeped into every corner of the band's life. At first, onto a catalyst, then a steering wheel, and finally, a chain. Glenn Hughes fell into severe addiction. He lost control of his finances, lost control of his rhythm of life. Relationships grew fragile. Performances turned into tests of survival rather than spaces of creation. The stage was no longer where music was born. It became a place to try not to collapse in front of the public. For Glenn, the pressure took on a very concrete form. He had to fill the void of a band losing its direction, while he himself was also sliding downward. Confidence on stage concealed another reality behind the curtain. A man dependent on stimulants just to make it through each night's performance. In 1976, the inevitable happened. Deep Purple disbanded. Not in a massive explosion, but through exhaustion. When the band disappeared, Glenn Hughes lost his final layer of protection. No more brand, no more structure, no more collective to dissolve himself into. Only him, and a vast vacuum of identity. From a member of one of the biggest bands in the world, Glenn fell into a suspended state. Not completely gone, yet no longer clearly present. The success that once lifted him now turned back and bit him. And at the intersection of fame and self-destruction, the question began to haunt him. When music is no longer a refuge, what does an artist cling to in order to keep existing? That was the moment Glenn Hughes stepped out of the lights of Deep Purple and straight into the darkest part of himself. After the collapse of Deep Purple, Glenn Hughes entered the 1980s as a man without a map. He did not disappear entirely from music, but neither was he truly present at any center. Solo albums were recorded sporadically, unfocused, unsupported, and quickly passing by without leaving a clear mark. There was no band behind him, no structure, no grand narrative to anchor his name. As the rock world changed rapidly, Glenn gradually became a name belonging to the recent past. MTV began shaping images. New faces emerged. Music grew more commercial, more easily identifiable. Glenn Hughes, with a powerful soul voice yet unattached to any specific brand, slipped into a gray zone. He was not classic enough to be revered, nor new enough to be sought after. Finances became unstable. Contracts were uncertain. Performance offers came and went. Small, fragmented, disconnected. Glenn was no longer living within the orbit of an artist protected by the industry. Every project was a gamble, and most of them were lost. In that context, drugs were no longer a backstage habit. They took over his entire life. Cocaine appeared not only after shows, but before recording sessions, before meetings, before even the most basic decisions. Glenn Hughes no longer used stimulants to heighten emotion. He used them to sustain existence. His body began to pay the price. Daily rhythms collapsed. Memory fractured. Relationships were destroyed not through dramatic explosions, but through repeated broken promises. People no longer knew whether Glenn would show up on time, whether he would be sober enough to complete a project. And gradually, opportunities no longer needed to be declined. They simply disappeared. The most painful part lay in the paradox. The voice was still there. While many artists of his era lost their voices through abuse, Glenn retained a remarkable inner strength. His vocal cords, inexplicably, endured. But that voice was increasingly placed in poor contexts. Undisciplined studios, unstable bands, poorly prepared performances. The sound did not die, but its meaning was being eroded. Glenn Hughes gradually slipped into isolation, not through public blacklisting, but because he became difficult to reach. No one wanted to invest time, money, and trust in someone who could not control himself. He lived inside a closed loop. The more control he lost, the fewer opportunities remained. The fewer opportunities he had, the tighter he clung to drugs. And at the deepest point of that decade, the question became impossible to avoid. How could a man gifted with a heaven-sent voice come so close to destroying that very gift? Not through a single tragic moment, but through thousands of small, wrong decisions, repeated over and over in silence. Glenn Hughes had not yet lost his voice, but he was losing himself, little by little, year by year. This was the period when people no longer spoke about his music. They only whispered about his decline. And when an artist exists merely as a warning rather than as a voice, that is when disappearance has already begun. Even if the body is still standing there, still breathing there, still able to sing, if anyone is still listening. In the early 1990s, change did not arrive as a dramatic moment. There was no stage, no spotlight, no triumphant comeback for audiences to applaud. For Glenn Hughes, the decision to get clean happened in silence and in fear. Fear of living sober, fear of facing the lost years, fear of accepting that he could not return to the starting point, only move forward from a place very close to the bottom. Sobriety did not restore the past. It restored responsibility. Glenn was forced to look directly at what he had broken. A fractured career, shattered relationships, eroded credibility. There were no more excuses, no more fog to hide behind. Clarity for him was not a victory. It was bare ground from which to begin again at nearly zero. Music returned slowly. Glenn did not try to reclaim the peak. He recorded with a new discipline. He wrote and sang with a patience he had never possessed before. His solo albums were reassessed by critics, not as the products of a fallen legend, but as the voice of an artist who had survived himself. The voice was still powerful, but no longer showy. It carried the depth of experience, of regret, of knowing when to stop. At the same time, Glenn opened the door to collaboration. He appeared in numerous projects, not to assert status, but to work. There was no longer pressure to prove anything, only the need to stand inside music in a healthy way. And it was precisely that attitude, sober, steady, unhurried, that created the true turning point. That turning point was called Black Country Communion. a band born not from nostalgia, but from balance. Glenn Hughes stood alongside Joe Bonamassa and Jason Bonham, in a convergence of classic rock and modern blues. Here, Glenn was no longer a man struggling to stay afloat. He was the one shaping the groove, holding the structure, guiding the emotional flow. The difference lay in position. Glenn Hughes did not return as a trembling survivor. He returned as someone sober enough to lead. Not through power, but through stability. Not through ego, but through experience paid for at a very high price. This return was not loud. There were no grand declarations. No need to resurrect a legend. It was sustainable because it was built on the right foundation. Discipline, sobriety, and the acceptance that success is no longer measured by peaks, but by the ability to remain. For Glenn Hughes, rebirth was not about becoming someone else. It was the first time he was able to be himself, without needing to run away. When looking back at Glenn Hughes's career, it is very difficult to place him into the familiar categories of rock history. He is not a guitar god, not someone who defined an era through riffs, not an iconic frontman, not a fixed central image standing at the front of a band. Nor is he the strategic architect of a rock empire tightly managed across decades. But Glenn Hughes's legacy does not lie in what he was not. It lies in what he managed to keep. His voice survived after everything else collapsed. After the bans, after the glory, after the years of self-destruction. It was not protected by image, nor frozen inside the memory of a single era. It continued to appear on small stages in projects that had nothing to prove, among audiences who did not come looking for nostalgia, but to hear a living human being. What makes Glenn Hughes different is not sheer vocal power. It is acknowledgement. He never built his legacy by denying the past. He speaks about addiction, about weakness, about the years of losing himself, without embellishment, without romanticizing. In a rock world accustomed to turning tragedy into myth, Glenn chose the opposite path. He turned recovery into value. Many rock icons are remembered because they died young. Their deaths became sharp outlines for legend. No time to be wrong, no chance to decline. Glenn Hughes did not have that privilege. He lived long enough to make mistakes, long enough to collapse, and long enough to have to stand back up in silence after the lights had gone out. That is precisely what makes his legacy harder to define, but also more durable. Glenn Hughes did not become a legend because of a final moment. He became an icon because of the process. Because he showed that rock does not have to end in tragedy, and that long-term existence is sometimes the bravest act of all. Glenn Hughes's legacy does not reside in charts or record numbers. It resides in a simple yet rare idea: that an artist can acknowledge his own fragility, survive it, and continue to create without pretending to be immortal. In the history of rock, where death is often treated as the final exclamation point, Glenn Hughes stands there as an ellipsis, a reminder that a story does not have to end early to be meaningful, and that sometimes recovery itself is the hardest legacy to achieve. So what truly happens when a voice nearly destroys itself? It can disappear, quietly, as if it never existed. It can become a memory, recalled through nostalgia, framed within a past era. Or it can live on as a cautionary tale, a dark reminder of the price of fame. But with Glenn Hughes, the answer took a different path. That voice did not die, did not fall silent, did not surrender. It stayed, not because it was protected, but because it was chosen. Chosen sobriety, chosen confrontation, chosen to keep living while every easier escape had once been laid out before him. Glenn Hughes did not conquer an era. He did not redefine rock. Nor did he turn himself into a museum of the past, a place people visit to gaze at a legend that has stopped breathing. He did something harder. He survived. He survived the collapse of bands, survived addiction, survived having to look back at himself when there was nothing left to hide. In a rock world accustomed to glorifying tragic endings, Glenn Hughes exists as a quiet counter-argument. No exclamation point needed. No final catastrophe required to seal meaning. Just continuation, day by day, show by show, each breath placed where it belongs. And perhaps that is the most revolutionary thing in rock. Not to burn brightly and vanish, but to stay long enough that the story does not end where everyone expects it to. If you love real stories behind rock icons, not just the glory, but the price paid to keep existing, subscribe to Icons and Legacies. Here, we do not retell legends. We follow the human beings behind the legends. Those who survived, changed, and left their mark in the quietest way. See you in the next story.
Thank you.